So yeah, welcome. My name's Mitchell Owens. I'm one of the production instructors here at Maven. And today, as part of our workshop slash webinar, we're learning about audio warping in Ableton. It is without a doubt like the most iconic feature of Ableton from version 1. This was like, it's sort of like flagship feature. Was the ability to take audio and warp it to any tempo or pitch without, destroying the quality of the audio, and it does that extremely well. How many people have used Ableton before? Quick show of hands. All right, nice. So this is really something really good for people who are just starting to use Ableton or have never used it before, and it's also good for people who have been using it for years and may not fully understand the what goes on behind the scenes when you're warping audio, and how to maybe not do it correctly. There's really no like right way to do it, but how to do it with purpose and in an intelligent way, and to sort of realize your end goal and actually get there purposefully with these steps. So Ableton has many like different ways of warping things. It handles all different kinds of audio, anything from percussive things to textural things like pads, to even full tracks. Ableton can also be used as a DJ software. You can use it in conjunction with like an APC40, and you can actually use it to DJ the same way that you would use like turntables. And it's really nice because you can actually warp full tracks and sync them to a tempo, and then you can actually change the tempo and the tracks will speed up and slow down as you do that. And I'll be demonstrating how you can warp your songs to a tempo and be able to change the tempo within the session without like changing the pitch, because you can, if you're like playing with vinyl, if you change the tempo on the turntable, it will change like the pitch of the song as well. Since the record will be spinning faster, the pitch would go up. Sweet, cool. So let's pull something in. So Ableton has, let me pull in a quick drum loop here, make sure this is going. Yep, all right, cool. All right, so I'm gonna start with a little drum beat here. Turn this up. And, oh, there we go. All right, cool. So we have this. We got this drum part here. Just a little drum break, and we can notice that if I put the metronome on, right, they're completely detached from each other. The drums aren't synced to the tempo of the session. And granted, when I exported this drum break, I found the BPM and I marked the name at 101 BPM. But there's ways to make sure that this is tempo locked, even if you don't know the BPM of the actual drum loop. And it's actually quite simple and actually doesn't involve any warping. But this is our first step to make sure that this is at the right tempo before we start to warp it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to the tempo section, and I'm just going to bring down. So I know that this is, I believe it's a 2-bar loop. Let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it's a 4-bar loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the tempo until this clip fits into a 4-bar segment here in Ableton. So you'll notice that as I bring the tempo down, I'll just do it 1 BPM at a time. You can actually see that the clip is getting smaller, and it's slowly fitting into 4 bars. So here's the end of 4 bars right here. And so we can see that at 101 BPM, we're right inside that 4 bars right there, right? If I zoom in, however, you actually notice that we're not quite up to that exact point at the end of 4 bars. And so luckily Ableton actually allows you to change things all the way up to 100th of a BPM. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change that So I'm going to get a little more precise here with my tempo. So I'm going to push it up just a little bit right there. Okay. So it's actually like 101.6 BPM. And it seems strange a little bit. But this was like played by a real drummer, so it makes sense that it wasn't exactly 101 BPM. It was like kind of somewhere in between. So once I do that, what I will do is I'm going to consolidate all this to make sure that the entire clip itself is exactly 4 bars. And I do that because you still see, even though it's such a small piece, this clip actually still doesn't go all the way up to the end of that 4 bar mark. So what I want to do is I just want to create a clip that contains this audio that is exactly 4 bars. And I do that, I change my grid, I right click, hit 1 bar, highlight all 4 bars, and then I'm going to hit Command J, and that's going to consolidate that for me. And if I zoom in here again, as far as I can go, now we can see that the clip is all the way moved up to that 4 bar mark. All right, cool. So we got 4 bars here. Let me loop this. Cool. So it's right in tempo. It's sync to the grid, sync to the tempo. So now we are we're good to go here. Okay. So warping. Ableton has multiple different warp modes. The way that we're going to access those is when we select our clip here, double clicking on this little colored bar up here at the top of the audio file. It'll open up our sample viewer down here. And in our sample editing window over here, I can zoom in a little bit for you. We can see we have a button that just says warp. And right now it's grayed out, so the track is not warped. So even though I've changed the tempo to make sure that this drum loop is at 101 BPM, or actually 101.6 since it was a little weird. Even though it's unwarped, it's still synced to the tempo. But let's say we want to change the tempo of the drum loop, right? Let's say we want to slow it down, or let's say we want to like make some drum and bass and speed it up considerably. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to select warp. And now you'll notice that Ableton has overlaid the grid onto our audio file down here, meaning that it's warped. And at the very beginning here, you can see this little yellow marker, and that's what's called a warp marker. And that's what's going to allow us to move things around, stretch them, or compress them within the audio file. All right, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the tempo just at 101 flat, so we're not sort of in between. And so now that it's warped, we can change this tempo to any tempo we want, and the drum loop will follow. So let's go slower first. Right? And so it's gonna match whatever tempo you set the session at. And we can do the same thing if we go faster. Right? So we can speed them up as well. So if you look under where it says warp here, we have this drop-down menu that gives us 6 options. And this is where the warping in Ableton can get very powerful. So you have these 6 different algorithms that warp different kinds of audio in different ways. So the first one here is beats. So this is typically for percussive things, you know, drums, any kind of, you know, percussion, anything like that. Then we have tones. So this is for like monophonic instruments like synthesizers or bass sounds. It's not too great with vocals, but they have another algorithm that's a little better for vocals. Underneath that is texture. This is for polyphonic instruments, pads, guitars, piano, anything that's a little bit noisy, you know, anything that has like more harmonic content, something that has a little more character to it in the sound, not as simple as something that's like monophonic, like a bass or like a lead synth or something. Then we have repitch. Repitch actually warps things as if it was like a record, like a vinyl record. So as the tempo slows, the pitch also goes down, and as the tempo increases, the pitch would go up. And that can be a very useful effect. You can actually use that to sort of get that like vinyl stopping kind of sound, where like a record would like suddenly stop, and you get that sudden decrease in pitch into silence. These last two are where we get to the least destructive warping algorithm. So complex is complex is great for almost anything. It can warp anything. Usually I actually stick with complex or complex pro when I'm doing warping, just because it handles almost anything pretty well. Complex would be for like full tracks. So if you have a full track that has drums, bass, pads, you know, the entire arrangement, this is what you want to use because it's the least destructive. It doesn't focus in on the, you know, specific qualities of a sound like the other algorithms do. It tries to preserve everything as much as possible. And then there's Complex Pro, and this is also really good for full tracks, but it's the best for vocals. The reason being is because we can choose how many formant frequencies remain in the voice, and I'll talk about formants here in a second. All right, so we have a drum beat. So pretty obviously we're going to want to stick with beats. And as you can see, it does a pretty good job, right? The slower we get though, you can kind of hear that like stuttering that happens after. And that's down to the what I would call, I guess, like the envelope that it creates. I forget what Ableton calls it. The transient loop mode. That's what Ableton's terminology for it. But if I go down here under beats, we can see when I select beats, we get a few menu options here. So the first one we have is what's going to be preserved. And it's going to default to transients. Transients are the initial attack of a sound, that initial increase in volume, like when you hit a drum and you look at the audio file here, this big spike here where that snare is would be called the transient. So what Ableton's going to do is it's actually going to look for those transients. It has like an auto detection system that looks for those spikes in amplitude, and it says, okay, that's probably a point where, you know, the producer wants to warp from. Especially with drums, it'll take every single transient. You can see up here all these little gray lines. That's where Ableton has assumed that's where you would want to place a warp marker. And so that's you know, kind of the result of that auto detection system working. And you can notice that when I hover over these little gray lines, I get a little gray like flag on top, and that's Ableton prompting me to drop a warp marker there to then stretch or compress the audio file. So I could double click and it turns yellow, and then at that point you can start dragging this out and back in to either stretch a sample out or make it a little shorter, or just like completely change the rhythm of it. Then we can also see in the same menu here, we have a bunch of subdivisions. So we can actually tell Ableton Live to only preserve the 32nd notes or the 16th notes or the 8th notes. You know, this is really useful if you just have like one single drum, like a loop of a single drum, and you know that, okay, it's a snare that happens every quarter note, then a good thing to do would just be hit quarter notes. And that way that would be the cleanest warping method for you to do, other than transients. But with these full drum arrangements like this, transients are probably going to be our best option here. So got transients going. All right, so our loop mode, here we go. So this is what happens. So the way that Ableton like stretches these things out is it actually splits it up into what you could refer to as windows or grains, where it takes the audio file and it chops it up into a bunch of small pieces, and then when you stretch it out, it stretches all of those pieces simultaneously, or like compresses them all simultaneously. And what this does is it dictates how those windows are played back. So you could hear, now let me zoom out. You could hear when I made this really slow, you get that, that kind of whirring sound like in the background. And that's because the loop mode that we're on now is playing forward and back. So when you stretch a sample so far that the original audio isn't large enough to extend to the next transient, what it does is it takes the tail end of that first sound and it will loop it forwards and backwards over and over again until you get to the next transient. Does that make sense? So like the initial kick drum plays, and so you heard that whirring sound stopped when it hit the hi-hat. So what it's doing is it's taking all those windows and it's going by each window and it's looping it forwards and backwards, over and over again until it reaches the next sound. And then once it does reach the next sound, it's again looping the window that is created from whatever sound it is just the cursor has just passed over. And then there's two more little loop modes. This one is just forward. So what it does is it essentially works as like a gate. So what that does is it plays it once and then that's it. There's no looping that occurs. So you can hear this. Yeah, so there's no looping that's going on. It plays that first transient and then there's just silence until you hit the next drum sound. And then there's the forward loop. So that's like called like forward stop, like it plays once forward and then stops. And then the next one is our forward loop. So instead of playing each window, front and forward and reverse, it just plays each window forward over and over again. So that's where we get more of like this kind of washy like stutter effect, and less of like a whir kind of thing that you get from the forward and reverse. So I'm going to speed this up back to a normal tempo. And all right, so this number here is our like envelope value, and this sort of dictates like how much of a gate is applied to the loop. So right now it's at 100%, so each loop plays 100% of the window. But if I like for example, if I speed this up a little bit, go like 150. When I decrease this envelope amount, you'll start to hear the gate come in. Right, so now it's shortening up the size of each window. So at 100, you're hearing, everything that is contained within each drum sound, right? And as I drag this down, you'll start to hear every drum sound get shorter. Until they're like, pretty much like just like these little tiny clicks. And then that works on pretty much every loop mode here. But the most drastic change here is obviously in our like gate loop mode, that forward and stop. Right. So Beats mode can be used in a lot of like cool different like sound design applications. I'd say my favorite thing is to like put something at like 250 BPM and then put it on this forward and stop mode, and then turn down the envelope amount. And you get these nice like super percussive kind of clicky percussion loops that can add like a nice kind of top end layer to whatever drums you're doing. And it works the same even if it's slowed down. Right, makes them like very, very short, kind of like stabby sounds as opposed to like fully decaying drum sounds. So, all right, so that's Beats mode. Best for drums. You can also do really weird stuff with Beats mode if you have like a pad. you can sort of like stutter things. So like if you have a pad and you put this on beats mode and let's say 16th notes. Right, so if you take like a pad, something that's really long and sustained, you put it on beats mode and you have it only preserve the 16th notes, then Ableton's only gonna open up that window every 16th note. And then if you drop the envelope amount down, right, the amount that window is decaying before it reaches the next window, you start to get these cool stutter effects. Right? And you could put on 30-second notes. And there's also like little clever like Max for Live objects that can automate this parameter as well. So you could, you know, start out with your big sustained pad and then, you know, pull that down and, you know, create some kind of momentary effect like that. So yeah, so it's meant for drums, but you can also get a lot of interesting sound design functionality out of Beats Mode. All right. All right, so there's our Beats Mode. The next one is tones. So this is for our monophonic instruments. So if we go, let's see what I got in here. I know I had some bass sample. Here we go. All right, sweet. So we got this bass. It's at 125 BPM. So I'm going to jump up to 125, just like that. And you can see that, again, it's unwarped. Let me talk a quick little tangent here about our system preferences. So Ableton by default will auto warp your samples. I didn't realize that until like 2 years after I started using Ableton. I'm just like, why is all my stuff all messed up? But I realized that if you go into preferences and you go into record, warp, and launch, under this menu here, warp and fades, you can actually tell Ableton to leave things unwarped. And if you're really starting to chop things up and you want to really change something a lot, it's better to import it unwarped, so then you can, you know, kind of fully customize it from the get-go. So that way Ableton, because the warping algorithm or system in Ableton Live is very good, it's very accurate, but it's not 100%, and you'll find that a lot of times with like more complex samples, it'll actually end up doing more bad than good. So I would usually recommend that you import things as unwarped. And so yeah, so you just go under here and you say unwarped one shot, and we're here where it says auto warp long samples, we'll just leave that off. All right, cool. So got our bass. And the sample was recorded at 125 BPM. So I put my session tempo at 125 BPM. And then I'm just going to hit warp here. All right, cool. And we're going to go ahead and put this on tones. So tones gives you more control over how large these windows are, and here Ableton is. That was an interesting sound. I think there's a synthesis class going on in the other room, so they're making all kinds of weird sounds. All right, so down here we can see that we no longer have any parameters to control, you know, what is being preserved, and, you know, no envelope amount. We only have a grain size, and Ableton Live refers to them as grains, but it's the same thing as windows. Those terms are interchangeable. So the number here is kind of arbitrary. It's just 0 to 100. So it's not really like in milliseconds or in length of samples or anything like that. So best way to demonstrate this is to slow this way down. And by changing the grain size, we're changing how large these windows are. And when you're working with actual like instruments that aren't percussive and have tones to them, you really start to hear the transition between each one of those grains, and you'll get more of like a kind of staticky effect. So the larger the grain, the more destructive uh, the process is to the audio. The larger those windows are, and the more we actually end up losing more the larger the grain size is. Because as each window gets larger, Ableton Live has a harder time sort of stitching them back together to give you like the final product. So typically with things like this, if you're slowing something down a lot, you want to go to a smaller grain size. And especially with lower frequencies, which are going to be harder to recreate when you're warping, just because the wavelengths are much longer than higher frequencies. A smaller grain size will give us a much more fine sort of processing of the sound itself. So if I slow this way down, we can start to hear. So if I put it on 100, especially right here, you can hear that like stutter right at the beginning. And that's because the grain size is so large that we're actually getting an audible stutter when we're warping it that slow. So let's go back up to original tempo here. Let's slow it down a little bit. We'll go to 100 BPM. So let's say we want to change the rhythm of this sample. Say like the rhythm isn't exactly what we're like. We like the bass sound, but we want to change the actual rhythm of the way that the bass was played. So this is where our warp markers here come into play. So if I zoom in a little bit here, so we can see again we have our Ableton has auto detected the transients in the sample. So we can just like drop a few here at the beginning of these bass sounds here. And I'm just double clicking on top of each one of these warp markers like that. And so once you've done this, you can move these anywhere around. The one thing is each one of these warp markers acts like an anchor. So when you've placed that warp marker there, that one spot will stay stationary as you warp another spot in the audio file. So let's take this sample or this bass hit right here, which is on the and of 2. And let's say we want to put it on the downbeat. So we want to put it on beat 3. So it's as simple as just left click and holding on the warp marker and then just dragging it out to wherever you want to put it on the grid. And so you'll notice that the beginning of each one of these bass hits has stayed stationary, but everything after that warp marker has moved. So I can move that back just to show you. So everything in this first bass hit is getting extended, actually. And that's because there's no warp marker at the end of the bass hit. There's only one at the beginning. So it's anchoring the beginning of the sample, and everything after that until the next warp marker will end up getting stretched out. So if I wanted to preserve that, I could drop another warp marker right at the end, and then I could pull that back out. And now what's getting stretched is essentially near silence, so it'll sound a little better. Speed this back up a little bit. And so like, let's say we wanted to mimic the same rhythm, but here at the second part of the sample. So we'll just repeat this process, drop another warp marker at the end of that bass hit, and then extend this one out. And let's put a little drums on top of this, make it interesting. So our rhythm was like this. And we wanted to change it to this. Right? So it works for changing the rhythm. We can keep going with this and change that put this over here, extend that back. This is really useful. I mean, in today's world of like sample packs on sample packs on sample packs that you can just like buy or download for free on the internet, there's just like, you know, this influx of music that's made with like pre-made sounds, which is no problem. But if you want to add like, you know, your extra bit of creativity, like, you know, make it your own, this is a great way to do that. It also works, you know, for like acapellas, like, you know, if you take an acapella from someone, you know, some artist, you can completely change the rhythm of those words to fit, you know, almost any tempo or any genre or anything like that. And that's a really good way to, one, detach yourself from that, you know, pre-made sample kind of black hole that's out there now. And it's also a great way to, you know, get away from any legal situation that you might get yourself into, you know, if you're using anything. Yeah, what's up? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So the very beginning. Right. Yeah. 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 So the question was, you know, why drop that warp marker, you know, a little bit after the transient. And one reason is because I was using Ableton's sort of like anticipated location as to where it might, you know, think that I would want to place my warp marker. So I was sort of doing it in like a quick fashion in which you could just hover over that suggested warp marker position. And typically you're right. It's actually not going to, if I zoom really far in here, it's actually not going to fall exactly on the very beginning. You can see there's a little bit cut off. But a span of time that small is typically not going to be that audible. And unless you're working with something like a drums, you typically won't get too many clicks. So in this case, it's probably safe to say that it'll be okay. But if we were working with drums and doing this, then you would absolutely want to make sure you're like, you know, spot on at the transient of that drum sound. Yep. Cool. All right, sweet. Got that. So we can do the same process over here with drums. Put this on beats and warp it. So we can like totally change the rhythm of these drums. So right now it's just like 4 on the floor, house groove. Could be any song. So we can actually warp these around. I'm going to put a warp marker on this sound here to keep it stationary. And you can notice that with beats mode, I got that little stutter effect. Since it's, you know, looking for transients, when it doesn't find any more transients like that, it's going to start looping the window like we were talking about before. But a lot of times that can actually be really interesting. You can get, if you're purposely trying to get like a glitchy sound out of your drums, destructive editing like this can be very useful. So let's do this a couple more times. I'm going to push this one up. And then once we warp this, then we can also like go in and edit the actual sample itself. So we could even like take this kick drum and copy it and paste it over here. And do that. And we can do the same. I kind of want to drop another kick drum right here. Say just that bit and paste it over here. And so again, we've taken like a pre-made loop, something that someone else made, and we can completely change the rhythm of it, but still preserve the sound. So like, you know, if we really like the kick drum, but we don't like the fact that it's just 4 on the floor, and so we can actually change it and make it a little more syncopated that way. All right, so our next warping algorithm is called texture. So I'm gonna get rid of this here. So texture is mainly for pads, like big, long, sustained, like polyphonic instruments. It works well for pianos even, or like string sections, stuff like that. So I can drop in a pad here, extend the loop out. There we go. And again, so I'm gonna lower my tempo until this is a 4-bar loop. So it looks like it's gonna be 100 BPM. Consolidate that 4-bar loop. There we go. So with texture, put it on texture, we get two parameters here. We get grain size and we get flux. So we already saw grain size, right? So this is like the size of our grain, what Ableton is doing when it's like chopping it up into a bunch of little tiny pieces. That's going to be the size of each one of those pieces. Flux is this cool feature where it'll actually sort of randomize how large the grain size is. So we can start to get these really cool, like, you know, glitchy effects or different like stuttered effects. And this is the best if you want to take like a pad like this. And so right now it's only 4 bars long, but let's say we want to make it 8 bars long. And there's a really easy way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and drag my loop bracket out to 8 bars. So there's 2 ways to do it. There's the long way and the short way, of course. The long way would be to, you know, take this loop or this clip, consolidate it to make consolidate it with an extra 4 bars of empty space by doing that, like Command J after selecting an 8-bar segment, and then it essentially gives you an extra 4 bars of just silence at the end. And the long way would be to drop a warp marker right at the end and just stretch this thing all the way out to be 8 bars. And then it's going to sound like this. Put this back on texture. Right? But there's a much quicker way to do this. If we select our clip here and we go under, so our here, this is like the detected BPM here. Under here we have two buttons. One says divide by 2 and one says multiply by 2. And so you can see that when I hit multiply by 2, it doubles the length of the clip. So it's a really easy way to, you know, just double anything, make it twice the length as it was before. And then it also works in the opposite direction. Hit divide by 2, and then it will shorten the clip by half. So I'm going to hit times 2 twice, get us to 8 bars. All right, so now let's mess around with the grain size. So the higher the number, the larger the grain. And you can kind of hear there's a little bit of like a tremor in the sound, which is each window transitioning to the next. And the lower the grain size gets, the more of this like granular texture we start to get. Right? Now when we get this small, when our grain size is so small, like this small, for example, it's actually doing something that's very similar to what's called granular synthesis, which is where you take a sound, you chop it up into so many small pieces, and if the pieces are small enough and they're played back fast enough, you'll actually start to create a new pitch. So you're actually synthesizing a new sound off of chopping up one audio piece into a bunch of tiny little grains and then stitching them back together and playing them at a new speed. And again, so this is, you know, one great way to extend, you know, warp something, make it longer or shorter, but it's also a great sound design application if you're just looking for some weird sounds or some, you know, experimental textures to put into your music. So you can see, like, with the grain size on 2, this thing's pretty much useless now unless you want like this kind of noise. And you can hear the pitch go down. So going from a grain size of 2, I'm going to increase it and pay attention to the pitch of the sample here. So as it goes up, you can start to hear that pitch of that noise that was sort of added as an artifact start to go down as our grain size becomes so large that the frequency of the playback of the grains is below our audible level of hearing. So usually that butter zone is like in between like 75 and like 200, where you're typically going to get your best results. So for your cleanest warping, texture is best for pads. If you really want to get some weird stuff, let's go back to this like funk, sort of funk groove. So go back and say 101. And hit warp again, put it on texture. And then I'm going to multiply by 2. And so now this is where we can really start to hear that grain size. So if I put the grain size really high, we start to get like audible echoes of the sound because it's taking each window and it's like repeating it over and over again until it reaches the next sound. And so then if we put flux up, we take the grain size down. So taking the grain size down is going to give us more definition. It's going to recreate the original sound a little better. But by adding the flux parameter, we're going to introduce a bit of randomness into the grain size. So you can hear that grain size is occasionally, getting larger or shorter, giving us sort of a randomization of the size of our windows here. And so you can do all sorts of cool stuff with this. You can like open a new audio track, and essentially, so this is where the process of resampling becomes really useful, where you can, destructively edit something like this, record it to a new track, and then start to, really manipulate it. So in this case, I'm going to set the input as this track and record a little bit of it. That's enough there. So what I've done is I've essentially like printed the texture warping sound that we're getting to a new audio file. So if I solo out this track, so without any warping, it now sounds exactly like the old one. And so we can take little bits of these, like these hi-hats, for example, and take these out. Let's say we can reverse them. There's a nice little reverse button here. It just says rev. And if we hit that, it'll reverse it. So we can get, interesting like reverse percussion. Take another sound like that. And let's see, you can pitch it down. There's a transpose knob here. And by like editing these together with these different warping algorithms, you can start to kind of add a fair amount of interesting little sound design bits to whatever you're working on. So like with this, if I put this back on complex, we can actually hear what it sounds like again. Divide that by 2. So then like out of that drum loop, we've managed to like extract something that's been sort of mangled a little bit and then, kind of flip it into something that adds a little bit of like extra dimension or like rhythmic dimension to it. So that's texture. Texture's great for, a lot of different sound design applications. It's typically how I use it the most, is just to like really destroy things and, push the limitations of that audio to like get something that's like completely, unexpected out of it. I typically don't go into using texture like, I'm going to do exactly this. I end up, stretching it really far, messing around with the grain size. You can automate those parameters as well, so they can change automatically over time. And that way you can start to get some really interesting stuff. very like Autech or Aphex Twin kind of sounding stuff. All right, cool. So repitch is very simple. We can use the same little drum loop here. So repitch essentially mimics the way that pitch shifting happens when you change the tempo of a vinyl record. So with this warped on repitch mode, you can see there's no parameters included with repitch mode. It's just does one thing. So as I change the tempo, you'll notice the pitch of the drums is going to change as well. Right? And so like back in the day, like back when like drum and bass was coming up, they were taking like breaks of like funk drummers, you know, like James Brown, like funky drummer, you know, they would take that break. They would have it on like a vinyl record and they would speed it up and then record that. And that's where you get the pitched up drum sound that you hear, you know, all the time in a lot of drum and bass music, from actually taking the sample and speeding it up. And the byproduct of that was pitching it up as well, which became like a very iconic sound. Those like very tinny sounding sped up drums. Cool. So that's repitch, very simple, right? Tempo changes will also affect pitch. And now we have complex mode. So this is very useful for warping full tracks. So I'm going to pull in this track here. This is a song by a student that I had. This is like his hip hop group from Cape Verde.
Verdade nua e crua, para mais é doer. Racismo tá existe, vida ingrata.
So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and get this into the proper tempo. So I just want to like count. And then I'm going to use Ableton's tap tempo button. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I opened my Finder. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see. Yeah. So we need to find the downbeat. So there's that downbeat. Yeah, right. That little ding, just right at the beginning. All right. So here's the downbeat, and I want to find that because I want to put that on an actual downbeat here in the grid. So I'm gonna go find measure 9 and drop that right at the beginning there, just like that. There we go. And let's see how close we were. All right, so we were a little slow, so I'm going to speed up the tempo a little bit, drag it back. All right, so it's close enough. And change this back to a bar. So now with complex, we can change the tempo of this song very easily without affecting the quality of the audio. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go back into our sample editor and hit warp. So now it's like locked to the grid, and now our tempo changes will actually begin to affect the tempo of the song. So it's preserving the pitch of the voice, even the samples in the background. And so we can even speed that up. So for anyone who is really into making like mashups and remixes, this is a great way to take like fully produced songs like this and like extract a little, tiny bit of it. You know, you can take that little tiny part, and then you can warp it to whatever the tempo of your song is. So if you're, you know, making, you know, I'm sure this guy would like kill me because I'm saying this. If you want to make like a dubstep remix of this song, you know, then you could take, you know, whatever part out of it that you wanted, and, you know, warp that up to 140 BPM, and be able to preserve the pitch of the rapper's voice, the pitch of the sample, that string sample in the background, which is really crucial for remixes. You know, if you want the remix to come across and you want people to actually hear the song that you originally sampled, which is, I believe, you know, a very strong aspect of good remixes, being able to actually quote the original very well, not like completely masking it under the track. This is a great way to preserve all that information in the song that you want to keep. So yeah, complex, again, there's no parameters involved with it. But the next and final warping algorithm is Complex Pro. And this is where things get very interesting. And this is where we can actually start to control what frequencies are being recreated as we warp certain things. Complex Pro is also going to be the best if we want to pitch things up and down, particularly with vocals. When you want to take a vocal and you want to pitch it to be the right key of the song you're using, or if you want to take someone's vocal and pitch it really far down so it's really low, or pitch it up really high, this is the best way to preserve the quality of that person's voice, but also to get rid of the quality of that person's voice. So to touch on formant frequencies for a little bit, formant frequencies are the things that add the timbre to a sound, meaning the quality of the sound. So for instance, the formant frequencies of a saxophone would come from the material of the bell, the shape of the instrument, how wide the like tube is that the sound has to travel through. The formant frequencies in our voice are dictated by, you know, the shape of your jaw, how large your diaphragm is, the shape of your mouth. All those things add to the quality of your voice. That's why every single person's voice sounds different, is because every person's body is different. So by removing formant frequencies, we can actually sort of mask what the original person's voice sounded like. La, 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 so here we go. We got Stevie Wonder, right? My Sharia Moore. So first I'm going to warp this so we can pitch it. Because you'll notice that if I pitch this down, you'll see that the sample will actually get longer. So if I pitch this down, it gets longer. If I pitch it up, it gets shorter. But we want to keep it at the same tempo, so we're going to hit warp. And that way, when we pitch things up or down, the length of the sample won't change. So let's go back over here. La, 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 so let's just start, put this on Complex Pro. And we'll notice that we get two parameters. We get formants and envelope. So first, let's pitch this down and see how that goes. La, 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 so what Ableton's doing right now is it's pitched it down, but it's still maintaining those formant frequencies in the Stevie Wonder's voice. So it's trying to preserve the quality of his voice. That's why it sounds like a little robotic, kind of. Now as I remove the formants, that's where it starts to like get rid of the actual quality of his voice, right? So what it's doing is the formant frequencies in Stevie Wonder's voice are for, you know, the pitch at which he's singing, which would be right. Guy's got a high voice, you know, lots of higher formant frequencies. So when we pitch it down and we remove those formant frequencies, it removes those high frequency formants and actually recreates his voice as if it was someone who had a naturally deeper voice. And that's how we get that kind of, you know, Barry White kind of sound down there, right? So if I increase the formants, if I turn the formants back up, So what it's doing is when the formants are added, it's trying to replicate Stevie Wonder's voice as if it was still Stevie Wonder but singing lower. And if we remove those formants, then it's like creating a completely different person in itself. So this works in the opposite way. If we pitch it up, we get like that chipmunk effect. Pitch it up a little bit. So again, recreating Stevie Wonder's voice as if he was trying to sing higher. And if I remove these formants, that's where we get the chipmunk effect, where now it's recreating Stevie Wonder's voice as if he was, like someone who's like a foot tall. And yeah, that gets, oh man. So you can see we increase those formants and it kind of recreates the timbre of his voice. Decrease the formants. Now, what's really cool about this is we can actually like regender people's voices by using this. So, we can take Stevie Wonder here, and I'm not going to pitch it up too much, just like 4 steps, and
La 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 la.
And by sort of like experimenting with certain amounts of formant frequencies, you can start to really accurately recreate someone's voice, but make it sound like it's a completely different person, make it sound like a child, or a woman versus a man, or anything in between.
La 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 la.
So by removing a little bit of those formants, but not all, we can really drastically change the character of the voice itself. Let's find a nice and same thing with let me just do this really quick with a female vocalist. Soul acapellas. Let's see, where's Loletta? There she is. There we go.
Every lady feels that her man is special. He's special to her. No matter how he looks, baby.
All right, so I'm going to warp this and pitch it down and make sure we're on Complex Pro. And now we're going to remove some of those formants. So remember, those formants are preserving, the quality of her voice. So by removing them, we're removing that characteristic timbre of her voice.
Every lady feels that her man is special. He's special to her. No matter how he looks, baby. It's the inside that counts. It's what's up front that counts.
All right, and so we can completely change it, and make it sound completely different.
Laugh in your face and try to take.
All right, are you gonna sing? Where is this?
I got my man. 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 I got my man.
Same thing. Pitch it up. Include the formants though, and now it's going to. Now it's going to sound like Loletta, but as if she was singing, 5 semitones above the original key of the song. So again, another great way to take acapellas and completely shift them into something that is unrecognizable from the original, which is a great way to do uncommissioned remixes. And kind of mask what not even remixes, but if you wanted to take an acapella and include a vocal melody in your song, but mask the fact that you actually took the vocals from a pre-recorded song, this is a great way to do anything like that. Sweet. So those are our 6 warping algorithms. We had beats for drums. Tones for like monophonic things, bass, lead sounds, texture for longer, more polyphonic sounds like pads or piano or guitar, Then we had repitch, which is gonna replicate that sort of vinyl slowing down and pitching effect that you get from that. And then we have complex and complex pro, which are more intricate algorithms that are going to preserve the original sound more and actually give us more control over how it recreates that with the frequencies that it either includes or doesn't include with that. Sweet. So we're just about out of time. So I'm going to open up the floor to any questions we had about any of this warping stuff. So make sure I understand your question. So we're trying to find out how to help Ableton find those transients a little better between the different warping algorithms, right? Yeah. So let's see. We can grab like these drums again. A lot of it has to do with the different algorithm that you're using. When you hit warp, you'll notice that it's automatically going to, you're talking about these little lines that it puts in to anticipate where you'd want to put a warp marker. So these aren't the final position that these warp markers can be. You can actually drop them anywhere in the audio clip. It'll suggest that you put it there, but even if I wanted to go over here and I could double click, you can manually drop one into a different spot. And that's usually the best way to do it. The best way is to zoom pretty far into your audio file and then manually choose a position where you want to do that. Now, even further, let's say we still can't quite get it where we want to. If you hold down Shift and then hold on the warp marker, you can actually move the audio instead of the warp marker. And that ends up being a very useful tool when you want to very precisely place these warp markers. So for example, I could place one here, and if I hold Shift and left click and hold on the warp marker, you can see I can move the audio instead of the warp marker. So I could, drop the warp marker on the next transient or even the next transient after that, and so on. So you have a little more accurate control over where you drop those. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. Probably got time for like a couple more questions. If we got any more other questions? No? Good? Cool. Well, thank you guys for coming. Thanks for stopping by. And yeah, safe travels home. Thanks for coming.